Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Day 1, Session 2 of the ALS United Greater New York Summit in partnership with her ALS Story. My name is Donnie Harris, and I'm honored to be here today alongside our wonderful panelists to moderate this session, her ALS Story, Caregiving for a Partner. Today's panelists include Gwen Petersen and Desi Kessler, who are part of her ALS Story. Since her diagnosis with ALS at age 32, Gwen Petersen has poured her energy into advancing the science of her disease through participation in clinical and observational research. Gwen works together with her beloved group, her ALS Story, to raise awareness that young people can also get ALS. Gwen is married to her best friend Nathan, and they are parents to an exuberant golden doodle named Annabelle. Prior to her diagnosis, Gwen worked as a recruiter for one of the top 10 medical centers in the U.S. Desi Kessler is 40 years old and lives in New York with her husband Paul and daughter Birdie. Birdie is 12 years old and has never known her mom without ALS. Desi is a tequila connoisseur and an avid partier, and surprisingly enough, she's also the disciplinarian. Our panelists also include Dr. Maureen Sessa and Dr. Florian Thomas. Thank you all for being here with us today, for sharing your experiences, perspectives, and expertise. Dr. Sessa, the floor is all yours.
All righty. Hello. So I am Dr. Sessa. I'm a health psychologist at the Neuroscience Institute at Hackensack. I do predominantly psychotherapy for individuals with various chronic illnesses. And I'm here with my partner, Dr. Florian Thomas, if he wants to quickly introduce himself as well before we get started.
Thank you, Dr. Sessa. I'm Florian Thomas. I'm a practicing neurologist and a founding chair of the Department of Neurology at Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine, where I also serve as co-director of the ALS Center. In a past life, I was chief of the spinal cord injury service at the St. Louis VA, where we took care of 1,000 veterans with spinal cord injury, multiple sclerosis, and ALS. So I have a lot of experience in talking to patients and their partners about partner relations and intimacy.
Alrighty, so let's get rolling. Thankfully, Jordana has been kind enough to share her screen for me due to some technical issues, but we're just going to keep rolling. All right, so for the agenda for today, we're going to be focusing on a variety of different topics regarding caregiving, but really the centerfold of all of this is identity and identity exploration. So first we'll talk about the different aspects of identity, since it's such a complicated topic, and how a sense of identity changes for both caregivers and individuals with a chronic illness over time. Then we're going to talk about how to navigate these changes and, as a conceded effort, revitalize your sense of identity. And then we'll hear a little bit of a caregiver perspective, which we were lucky enough to receive from one of our participants. Okay. All right. So identity in and of itself seems like a simple term, but if we really break it down, identity is a multifaceted, complicated aspect of life. So here, I just wanted to provide an example of all the different aspects of identity that can exist. So take a look to see the identity wheel and see all the different topics here. So in the center, we have more of the ones we consider more generally, right? Gender, national origin, age, different abilities. And then it extends even out further beyond that, what your education level is or where you received your education, different aspects of your family, your religious faith, income, communication skills. All of this play a role into who you are and who you become. We can go to the next slide. But some other aspects of identity that we typically explore, especially in something like psychotherapy, are the small internal experiences that we have from a moment-to-moment basis, because truly those are things that make up part of who we are. So this could be our needs from moment to moment, our wants for ourselves, for others, the future, the beliefs that we hold. That could be the certain rules that we have in our head about the way things are supposed to go, or how we think about ourselves or the future. Our different attitudes, like the way that we approach certain situations. Our hopes and dreams are very deeply personal and can be rooted in our sense of identity. And then our sense of meaning and purpose. I mean, meaning and purpose are directly connected to how we align with our sense of self. Okay. So what we're going to do today is talk about how all of that is involved in the idea of navigating relationships and also self-identity when there is a relationship where one partner is in a caregiver role, whereas one partner is dealing with some sort of chronic to terminal illness. All right, so just to say, in the beginning of a relationship, ideally, we are looking at more of an equivalent perspective, right? We have partner one and we have partner two. But as the diagnostic process initiates and then perpetuates, the roles begin to change for individuals. So partner one can start to take on the role of a patient, right? Somebody with a chronic illness, somebody with a diagnosis that's carrying with them. Partner two can turn to the role of caregiver. And while these are one aspect of somebody's identity, or we could even argue not necessarily identity, just a part of one's story, over time, based on medical care, seeking treatment, the way things progress, this might be the lens through which we start to see the world, the lens through which we see as a patient or as a caregiver. So let's break that down a little bit more. So first, from the idea of patient identity, right? What does that even mean? So this can start to occur when various changes happen in life. So first could be the idea of changes to appearance. When we seek any sort of serious treatment or we start to notice symptom progression for a disease, our appearance might change. This could be just different facial features, changes to mobility and functioning, weight loss or weight gain, depending on the circumstance. And that can lead to interesting new conceptualizations of self, right? I don't look the way that I used to, and I wonder what that means about me, right? Similarly, with communication and mobility, depending on the circumstance, as these things start to change, it changes the way that we can physically, emotionally, verbally navigate through the world. And so if that changes, it can lean into that sense of, well, okay, I do have to communicate differently. I do have to be more careful about the way that I move. Are there things that I can't do that I used to be able to do? So again, what does that say about me? Then from a more structural perspective, we might see changes to the roles in the family. I often hear from clients of mine that folks will, before their diagnosis, would be the independent person in the family, the one that everybody goes to, the point person who takes care of everyone, no holds barred, they can handle anything. And now we're in a season of life where that's not possible, right? Sure, there are things that you can help with, but the context has changed. And if you have aligned very closely with your sense of being the provider, the caregiver, the I don't know, the person who really takes control of situations, and that's no longer possible, that will bump up against a sense of identity. Similarly, with social life, we might have changes to that where we don't see friends or family as often, or the way that we interact with them changes. And then I think from a more deeper perspective, that really introspective aspect of who we are, our sense of meaning and purpose may change. You know, when we're thinking about the greater context of our lives and moving forward, we might have plans that we've considered or goals and aspirations, or even the way that we see our lives playing out. When a diagnosis comes into the room, that can really change. And so this can be seen as a negative, but at the same time, it can revitalize our sense of, well, okay, given my circumstances, what do I want to do with my life? How can I still create meaning and joy and purpose given what's going on? So it can kind of be a two-sided situation. Okay, next slide. Okay. So similarly, the variables here are quite similar, even though the way that they play out in real life will differ, right? So the one thing that I want to highlight when it comes to caregiver identity, because this is typically what we start to see across the board, is that there's this reduced sense of self-identity, right? So even in speaking to other folks regarding this panel, and also just in my experience as a therapist, when it comes to caregivers, their world tends to be very much centered on the caregiving role and the way that they relate to their partner. You know, rather than it being two people in a relationship, it's an individual with a diagnosis, and the caregiver almost orbits around that context. And so you start to lose senses of yourself because there's just reduced time, right? Increased physical fatigue, emotional fatigue, and things get prioritized to take care of the person that you love. And it's a beautiful thing, but it can also lead to confusion and uncertainty of who you are underneath all of it. Even though you are still there, sometimes it doesn't feel that way. More structurally, it can lead to changes to daily life activities, things that maybe you used to do that you enjoyed now shift to things that are more pertinent to the medical care or just what's going on for the person with the chronic illness. Again, changes to roles in the family. Maybe somebody has to step up in a way that they never had to before. Or it could be somebody who was already quite independent or the go-to person, and now that role is amplified, right? Talk about fatigue in that situation. Changes to social life too, right? If we're navigating medical appointments and treatments and symptom progression, life tends to get a little bit smaller in terms of just being a bit more insular. And even here, this could be seen as a negative or a positive given the context of what's going on for this person. Meaning and purpose tends to change too. Maybe there's a real sense of dedication and purpose to the idea of caregiving, right? But also it's seeking meaning not only from that, but all the other various aspects of life. And that's a pretty intentional act that has to happen. And it's easy for that to fall to the wayside, as caregiving goes on. One thing I wanted to touch on in relation to this too, while not necessarily related to identity, I just wanted to add more context of what's kind of going on with the undercurrent of living with a chronic to terminal illness, right? So I wanted to highlight 3 different kinds of grief that are happening almost at the same time, right? So they might seem really similar, but these are terms that we typically use in the oncology world to just talk about how grief will manifest and who it's relating to. So there's this idea of twilight grief. This is something that manifests honestly from the moment someone is diagnosed, right? It could even be in the interim of something has been noticed in blood work or changes to physical functioning, and we're waiting to hear results, right? And this involves both the individual with the illness, right? So someone with ALS and the partner. So it's a combined experience of grieving the life that you thought was going to happen for both you and your partner. So it kind of goes both ways. And that can exist all the way from diagnosis to end of life. As symptoms progress, we start to get a little bit more into these other 2 terms, which are anticipatory grief and preparatory grief, right? So just as the terms would suggest, anticipatory is more from the partner's perspective of anticipating the ways that things will progress, leading to more end-of-life concerns. And preparatory is that own individual experience of seeing things change for yourself, your symptoms, physical functioning, and that's for the person with ALS. So to zoom out, all of this might be happening at the same time as you're navigating your own sense of identity, your relationship, navigating a very complicated medical illness. And it's overwhelming, right? And so it's very easy to lose the sense of feeling rooted in who you are, right? So we're going to kind of talk about how we bring that back. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight here, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later in the presentation, is sometimes we need to actually delineate how we believe things have changed from pre to post. And what I mean by that is pre-diagnosis to the current context right now. So these are actually prompts from a really wonderful intervention, more so from the oncology world, but it's used in other domains as well, in meaning-centered psychotherapy. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it, but it's wonderful. Please look it up. And it's a way to explore ideas of meaning and purpose and legacy. And I like to introduce this in work with my clients because it highlights aspects of identity that maybe we don't think about a lot. So I just want to share this with you all. So the first prompt that we would do in work would be, think about a time just before the ALS diagnosis. Write down 4 answers to the question, who am I? These can be positive or negative and include personality characteristics, body image beliefs, things you do, people you know, etc. For example, answers might start with, I am someone who blank, or I am a person, or I am a blank, right? And this can be for the individual with ALS or the partner. Right? So as I'm talking, consider how you would answer those questions. We would then ask the prompt, now that you have had a chance to write down some answers to the first question, take a moment to think about how ALS has affected your answers. Are your answers the same? How has ALS affected the things that are most meaningful to you? Right? So if we look at these 2 paragraphs here, it's showing how our sense of identity can change, from pre-diagnosis to post. Excuse me, my computer is trying to log me out. Now I'm back. Okay. So we'll come back to this later in the presentation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, what we do to actually revitalize this sense of identity while engaging with caregiving. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. All right, so the main thing that I wanted to highlight here is this revitalization process. Now, there's a couple different variables in play when it comes to exploring self-identity, many more that are beyond the scope of this presentation, but I just wanted to highlight a few. So the one thing that I wanted to really stress is you are so much more than the role you are given, and you always have been, right? I think sometimes there is almost this acquiescence to, well, this is who I am now. I am a patient, or I am somebody with this diagnosis. I'm a caregiver. That is all I am, because really that's all we're kind of seeing in the lens of our experience. But you have been present and here on this earth long before that, right? And I think coming back to that sense is really revitalizing. So how do we do that, right? That sounds wonderful, but how does that actually work? One of the simplest things that we can do, and it might sound silly, but I mean it, is trying to find ways to make contact with the present moment. Often in society we'll akin it to the term mindfulness. But if we break that down, what that means is in a moment, right, when things are starting to get overwhelming, we're starting to lose our sense of a track, right? Stopping for a second and thinking, okay, what am I really feeling right now? What am I thinking about right now? What's going on in my body right now? It's a centering and grounding exercise to say, okay, I am here in this moment. What do I want? And what do I need? And even that, right? Those are some of the basic aspects of identity that I talked about earlier in the slides. Wants, needs, beliefs, all of that. And if we're able to hone back into that, we're connecting with ourselves. It's very easy to lose sense of that, but taking a second to breathe, regroup, and think about our needs and wants, that helps us reconnect with the present. Furthermore, you go back. Furthermore, we can look at our sense of values. So just even to define values, right? Sometimes it's connected to physical belongings, right? Our personal values. But here we're talking more about the ideological perspectives. What really matters to us? What are things that have been important to us prior to diagnosis, currently now? And that's a pretty deep exploration of what is important to you. Sometimes in life, we have values that are kind of bestowed upon us based on family or traditions or certain cultures. And that's all perfectly fine. But I do think that there is a benefit to getting to the root of your own values. What are the things at the core of who I am that really matter, right? Is it family? Is it, exploration? Is it creativity, joy, humor, anything like that? And finding ways within the context of your own life right now to explore those values. And yeah, they might look very different from the way they looked previously, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Rather than ridding ourselves of valued-centered activities, we can shift the context. And doing so keeps us more connected with a sense of who we are. What we can also do in that same vein is reconnect with pleasurable and meaningful activities, right? And I understand that that can be incredibly difficult when it comes to the ongoing caregiving responsibilities, right? From moment to moment, things might change. So these activities might be a little bit different from the way that you used to interact with the world. Sometimes it's even just stopping and taking a couple minutes for yourself or scheduling time out away from the caregiving role or out to do an activity, making sure that you're actually making time for yourself. And then one of the things that I wanted to talk about is exploring the sense of self outside of the caregiver role. As I was saying, that part of our identity can become the forefront, almost the entire thing of what we see. And so I wanted to bring in a metaphor that we use in acceptance and commitment therapy, which is my theoretical orientation. And it's called the chessboard metaphor. Just simply put, if we think of a chessboard, right, we have it here kind of on the screen. We have the board and we have the pieces, right? And you don't need to know anything about chess to talk about this. But oftentimes what happens is we will start to emphasize certain pieces on the board, right? The certain squares will seem bigger than others, certain pieces will feel like they're taking over the entire board. And we can akin those to our thoughts, our feelings, physical sensations, and the roles that we play, right? And all of these little pieces are moving around. We're trying to figure out what to emphasize, what to de-emphasize. But the real question is, where are you in all of this? And when it comes to this, we might originally think, well, okay, I've got to be one of the pieces on the board. But in reality, you are the board itself. You are underneath all of this, navigating thoughts, feelings, sensations, aspects of your identity, and they're all equally important and deserve attention, right? So if we can take that observer self perspective of, okay, all of this is around me, all of this is valid to who I am, maybe I can explore these aspects a little more. It adds a little bit more freedom to this process. Okay, next slide. All right. Another thing in terms of navigating identity and the caregiving role, right, is prioritizing a sense of intimacy. Now, I do know that in one of the future panels, they're going to be talking a bit more explicitly about this from the sexual physical side. So, of course, I want to take a step back from that and talk more about the psychological aspects when it comes to mental and emotional intimacy, right? So, before I begin, I know, Dr. Thomas, you wanted to kind of touch on this aspect of the intimacy.
Thank you, Dr. Sessa. So, as some of the partners and patients with whom we communicated in preparation of today's meeting have illustrated, living with ALS is, for the entire system or family, an incredibly stressful life. And it is very difficult to find time to relax. And obviously, relaxation is conducive to intimacy of any type. So I think some of the bullets on the slide touch upon that. And I think it's important for partners to find ways, despite all the odds, to set time and mental energy and interest aside to lay the groundwork for sexual and physical intimacy. This might require separating the physical needs of the patients in terms of mobility, bladder and bowel care, eating, from intimacy and sexual activity, possibly by finding caregivers who can relieve the care partner who is tasked on otherwise to providing those needs of the patient. That may not always be easy, because obviously all the care partners are by now extremely experienced in the patient's needs, and they may feel like somebody else is not equally well versed in providing those for those needs. But I think it is important to find ways to separate those roles. And secondly, I think the trick is to maintain a sense of playfulness that is not goal-directed, but has a wait-and-see attitude towards what might happen. Like putting 3 4-year-olds into a sandbox where there is no specific desired outcome other than possibly avoiding a fight. So that takes trial and error, and it requires setting preconceived notions apart of what pleases the other person, because what pleases the other person and what one partner can accomplish towards pleasing the other person may be in flux and changing due to the underlying illness and also due to what's going on at the moment. So those are some of my comments that we have shared in the past when I led the spinal cord injury service, and we had a big program on physical and sexual intimacy for patients with traumatic spinal cord injury, but also with ALS and multiple sclerosis. Dr. Sessa?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate Dr. Thomas's aspect of prioritizing the idea of playfulness, right? I mean, there's a lightness that can come from having no expectations, right? Just being able to be together, be in the moment. So, what could this actually look like from a non physical perspective or non sexual perspective? Sometimes, when life becomes so centered on medical care, open communication, sure, it's detailed regarding the medical aspect of life, but checking in just generally of, well, how are you feeling? What has this been like for you? What do you need to unwind? What are things that we could do to just be together? That type of open communication, or even talking about the frustrations, the things that upset you, the anger about just the situation that you both are in. I think that's really important, because the more that we bury those feelings, the more that we bury those thoughts. It's kind of like a common image would be if you've ever seen a beach ball floating in a pool, right? What little kids will like to do is they try to push down on that beach ball, right? Down, down, down into the water. And the second that they let go, it pops up. And we can think of that similarly in terms of our emotions, our thoughts, our beliefs. The more that we push them down, down into the water, the higher they're going to spike back up. And that's why it's so important to, when you can, in the moment, talk about what you're feeling, talk about what you're thinking. It's a bigger release than just putting it to the side. Though I know sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes that can just be shared activities, right? Maybe there's a show that you both love and you make sure that despite everything that's going on, you prioritize the time to watch it together. It could be just cultivating joy and humor in the small things, cracking jokes with each other, making light of certain situations, finding ways to explore all the aspects of the emotional experience, right? Rather than just the heavy ones. Physical touch is, of course, always involved, but sometimes it just looks a little different. Holding hands, touching a shoulder, being able to just even have a sense of eye contact, right? Really connecting in that way. And the idea of simply being together without an agenda, without some sort of goal or reason. It's just being in the moment, being in the relationship that you've cultivated for so long. Okay. Not surprisingly, one of the main aspects here when it comes to the caregiving role is finding ways, if possible, to seek support. And so that might seem like such a simple thing to say, but seeking support is multifaceted, right? And it also involves admitting that you need help. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, in fact, it's pretty important to have multiple players on the team to be able to reach a goal, right? So that can even start from a self directed sense of support. That's those check ins that I've been talking about. Taking a moment to say, okay, what do I need right now? What do I want? How can I make myself feel more grounded in this moment, feel more stable? That could mean taking some breaks from the caregiver role, meaning going for a walk. It could be taking moments to yourself, or sometimes it's just those mindful check ins. Going out further from that, if you are able to seek support from family and friends, I really encourage you to do so. There is an interesting notion sometimes that we often feel like we have to handle things on our own, right? Especially if you happen to be an independent person, somebody who has it all together. But when it comes to navigating chronic illness, the more hands, the better, right? And so I think admitting that you need assistance is really important. Now, sometimes that doesn't come from a personal context just due to, what's going on in your own life. And that's when I think professional support can step in, right? So for caregivers, that could be having more help around the house with an aide, but for your own personal experience, it could be seeking psychological support through counseling services. It could be going to support groups for folks who have similar experiences, talking even more openly with the medical practitioners, right? Making sure that you keep a team effort with all of this from the multiple layers of support. And the one thing that I really like to say with, clients that I work with, seeking support isn't selfish, right? I'm not sure where we got that societal idea, but it's not selfish, it's vital, right? We as humans are social creatures. We need community. We need a sense of belonging. And these illnesses can make it so isolating, right? And so it's an intentional act to say, I need to root down my sense of community. I need assistance. And that's okay. It's vital. All right, next slide. Okay, and I just wanted to briefly touch on this aspect too, just because I think, I've worked with various different illness categories, and this is something that comes up in really every single one. So I wanted to just bring it up briefly with talking about not just end of life, but talking about life in general, right? I think we can have both of them be present. So if we are speaking about end of life concerns, the sooner you start having discussions like this, the better. In a previous era of my career, I worked in hospice. And what I found a lot of the time, and my other practitioners would say something very similar, is that, when it comes to even having these discussions of comfort care, of seeing what life is going to look like closer to the end, people have the conversations too late, right? And I think having a true understanding of what your partner wants, what you want, and having those open dialogues, as uncomfortable as they may be, it allows for a greater sense of peace and understanding as you move forward. But part of that also means allowing space for thoughts and feelings wherever they may come from, right? And getting the perspectives of both relationship partners and finding ways to have both be heard and respected. Now, ultimately, this is the journey for the individual with the chronic illness, but the caregiver's perspective really should not be discounted, right? You are equal partners in a relationship and everyone should be heard, right? But I want to say, even beyond the aspect of end of life, is when a diagnosis comes into play, we start to just consider life a little bit differently, right? Sure, there's more contact with the sense of mortality, but it's also making the most of moments in life, right? And so that can be exploring aspects of legacy for both partners, right? What are the things that you have done in your life that you're proud of? What are the things that you'd like to explore further to align with your sense of who you are? What are things that you want to do together to have a combined legacy in your relationship? And that can deepen our sense of meaning through all of this and what can feel like a very chaotic or uncertain situation. So I also wanted to share, I was so moved by this. One of our panelists, Gwen, sent this in an email chain from a caregiver perspective. And I thought it would be, foolish if I didn't bring it into the presentation, because I think it highlights some of the aspects of what we've talked about today, as well as, the best person to ask in terms of what you need, what you want, is somebody who's going through this. So if you'll let me, I just want to quickly read this and then we'll wrap up the talk. Being a caregiver for my wife as she lives with ALS while also raising a 4-year-old child and working full time has been the greatest challenge of my life. The hardest part is that there's never really a pause. Every day requires balancing medical care, emotional support, parenting, work responsibilities, and the constant uncertainty that comes with this disease. There's physical exhaustion, but even more than that, there's emotional exhaustion from trying to hold everything together. People often say caregivers are strong, but the truth is that I do not always feel strong. Most of the time, I feel overwhelmed, exhausted, anxious, and stretched beyond my limits. I keep going because I have to, because my family depends on me, but that is very different from feeling strong. Sometimes simply making it through the day is the accomplishment. The next slide. What I wish I could say more openly is that caregivers struggle too. We love deeply, but we are often isolated, emotionally drained, and running on empty. I wish people understood that asking for help is difficult, and that even small acts of support can make an enormous difference. I also wish it felt more acceptable to admit how painful and frightening this journey can be without feeling guilt or shame for saying it out loud. The additional help I wish for is practical support and time, help with caregiving responsibilities, childcare, meals, errands, and simply moments to breathe and rest. I also wish for greater understanding from others about the long-term emotional and financial strain families experience when facing ALS. Most of all, I wish no family had to navigate this disease alone. Mm. It's so powerful. I mean, it highlights just how simple acts of support can make a world of difference. And so, you know, whether on the call, whether you're somebody with ALS, a caregiver, or somebody who's just here to learn, it's never a bad thing to check in with the people that you love, right? If you know somebody who is working through this, ask them what they need, right? Ask if there are ways that you can help. So, just to wrap up all of this, I wanted to just highlight some points. When it comes to the self-identity, right, the identity that can feel very lost in the caregiving role, what we can do to bring that back into the present is creating space for the self and for the couple, right? Aligning with ways of exploring who you were pre-diagnosis, right? Knowing that that still is part of you. It never went anywhere, right? It's just bringing it back to the forefront. It can be reconnecting with values and your sense of meaning and finding various ways of receiving help, right? And little by little. Just to say at the end, roles are bound to change in relationships as illnesses progress. It is just kind of a fact. But it's important to remember that that role is not all of who you are. It was not something that you were born with, that you were not born with this role. You are still there underneath all of it. And I think it's worth it to allow yourself to see that and embody that over time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sessa, and thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. This was such a thoughtful and meaningful presentation, and I feel like the discussion on identity, caregiving, grief, intimacy, and support truly highlighted the emotional complexity of navigating ALS, while also reminding us that both caregivers and individuals living with ALS are so much more than the roles that this disease can create. So thank you for that. Now we have some questions from one of our panelists, Gwen Petersen.
Thank you, Donnie, and thank you so much, Maureen. I just want to give a shout out to Maureen. We had a couple of practice sessions, and she really heard Desi and I's our comments, our feedback, and she really thoughtfully included that into her presentation. So, Rory, just a couple of questions for you, kind of post presentation.
Sure.
The slide about prioritizing emotional support really resonated. Desi and I are both married to two men, and as we know, men sometimes aren't great at expressing their feelings. We also heard in the caregiver statement the husband doesn't want to address his feelings because of the gravity, right, of everything else going on. Just Maureen, tactically speaking, how as a woman and the person living with ALS, how do we best approach our partners? How do we best kind of take that first step to opening up and starting the conversation?
That's a beautiful question. When you do highlight that, whether we like it or not, sometimes from a gender-based perspective, we approach situations differently. It might be more emotion-focused situation, or as you're saying, like when we saw from the caregiver perspective, we saw the practical approach. What they were looking for were direct acts, almost acts of service to help. And sometimes that might even be the way to start, right? Aligning with that sense of, okay, well, maybe if the emotional aspect isn't where we can touch first, what could we explore in terms of the practical needs, right? Because if this bumps up against a sense of, what they can do, right? Like I can't help as much as I want to, I can't be of service as much as I want to, exploring that, right? Because under that, you're going to hear the emotion, right? You're going to hear the frustration, the upset, the grief that's going on. Even if those words aren't said, you can see it in the underlying context. And then those questions could be like, I wonder if that's frustrating for you, that you can't do the things that you want to, right? Posing it almost as a question and seeing how that aligns, right? Because sometimes I think when we immediately go to like, well, what are you feeling? For some folks, they might get on the defensive. So start practical and then see underneath that, like, okay, where are we getting that emotion? How can we foster that? So that's where I would start.
Thanks, Maureen. Um, one more question, and then we'll turn it over to Desi. In general, it's so hard to find a therapist. Many therapists don't accept insurance. It can be costly. Overall, it's a daunting process. If someone living with ALS is trying to find a therapist, do you recommend someone looking for someone who has experience with chronic illness, terminal illness, someone who specializes in grief? I guess, like, how do we find someone with the right qualifications for us?
Phenomenal question. And to be honest with you, Gwen, one that I think is a question for really anybody who walks through the door for psychotherapy, right? Because while there are so many of us out there, it's such a wide pool that maybe we don't really know where to start, right? And even underneath all of that, we come from various different theoretical orientations. And what I mean by that is just the way that we practice, maybe some of the things that we'll emphasize or the goals that we set, how we think about thoughts and feelings. In all honesty, at the end of the day, you can do all these different practices, all these different modalities, but it comes down to how you really connect with your clinician, right? And so, even for folks who are not dealing with a chronic illness, they shop around, right? They find, maybe this therapist meets one need in one way, but it's not at meeting the needs in others. And so you shift. There's no harm in that. You're able to hop from clinician to clinician. When it comes to actually directly searching for providers, what's the one that people usually use? Psychology Today is usually what will come up in terms of finding a therapist. Some will actually list, in the tabs that they have specialization in chronic illness management or grief. So that can be your way to start. Or honestly, look for different hospital affiliations, right? If you know that a certain hospital system does treatment for ALS, right, you can see and even ask, do you provide psychotherapy services? I mean, not to plug us, for example, but that is something that we do, right? In terms of a neurology department, for those with certain illnesses, they are referred to us by our neurologist for psychotherapy services. So sometimes even looking at treatment centers in that way, where you receive your medical care, asking the question, okay, I mean, do you have psychotherapy services? And if not, can you direct me? So kind of working with the team that you already have.
Yeah. Thanks, Maureen. It's Desi. My first question for you. You mentioned that sometimes there is a struggle between you and your husband slash caregiver of who has it worse, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that and how or when it shows up in your relationship?
Oh, absolutely. That seems to be the central theme of many of our staff. For instance, if we disagree on what to do on a Friday night, his argument is usually, well, my entire life is a compromise, so let's just do what I want. Wow. I must be riding some ALS gravy train that I don't know about. And I think either side could be argued endlessly because it's all relative, right? I don't think there's a correct answer to who has it worse. I just don't know how to get that across to him.
Maureen, any initial reactions to that? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but how would we go about responding to that without my problem personally is like responding sometimes creates a larger argument. And a lot of that stems from to the point in your presentation pushing down our
Mm,
feelings. So
mm.
yeah.
Yeah, so navigate specifically in that, navigating which part of the conflict?
Navigating like, who has it worse and like, for me, I would probably escalate and like, how do you de-escalate in that moment? Yeah.
Mm,
Like
mm,
that would be that sentiment that Desi shared would be a trigger for
mhm,
me. So
mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, honoring that too, that it's something that would be really emotionally sensitive and bubble things up. I mean, that's incredibly important because, as you're saying, the more that we push things down, the more they fester. Honestly, sometimes in those moments, right, if something is said, there is a decision to make. Like we can root down into that experience and get into a conflict, or we can kind of open up our options a little bit. When I do work with couples, just from the greater scheme of things, right, it can be rather than getting into that same dynamic, we can take a moment, step back, and think, okay, we have three options right now. We could get into a problem solving mode together. We could argue and vent, or we could take some space and come back when we feel better, ready to actually talk more openly about this. So sometimes even saying, whoa, I'm having a reaction to this right now. Clearly, there's something that we need to talk about, but we need to take a minute. We got to take a beat, calm down, and come back, right? Because then you can actually more thoroughly think about what's happening. Um, so that would be my advice, really across the board when things get emotionally triggering, right? Acknowledging that when you have the conversation, right? Don't let that fall to the wayside, but give yourself a minute if you need it to process and regroup.
thank you. One more question for Desi, and then I see that there's a question from the Q&A. So, Desi, last question. Do you feel like you and your husband slash caregiver have to make a conscious effort to show each other intimacy? Yes, there's physical intimacy, but we talked a lot about emotional intimacy in this presentation. How do the two of you show up for each other? What are some of the challenges you face when trying to display emotional intimacy?
Physical intimacy is basically non-existent at this point. I get a pat on the head or a kiss on the forehead, which is disappointing. That's also a hard request. I have no problem asking my kid for a hug, but asking my husband for one feels too vulnerable. What kind of response will I get? I think we do try to be emotionally intimate. We have dates and talk, but typing your thoughts also has its limitations. I want more affection, but I'm afraid to ask. I want more connection, but it looks so different than before.
Thanks, it does. And that kind of goes directly into the question from the Q&A where where the person living with ALS can no longer communicate. Do you have to achieve the points discussed in the presentation? So Maureen, so and Dr. Thomas, so like how do we apply these things when we can, when we're no longer communicating verbally and yeah, any advice there?
Dr. Thomas, what do you think?
Well, I think it may require, so to speak, biting the bullet and making a deliberate effort to overcome one's own hesitation. And of course, that's really difficult. I get that. But somebody has to take the first step. And I think a forum such as this can possibly serve, or chat groups among people, to practice how to do this, to rehearse. There was a question a little bit ago about finding therapists who are knowledgeable and experienced in medical issues that psychologists deal with. I put a message into the chat for Donnie. I understand that ALS United is developing a counseling program for our patients. I haven't seen an update recently on where that stands, but I'm very excited about that concept because what was described by the questioner is the reality. Our ALS center is blessed with having a psychology staff of 10 people for the Neuroscience Institute. That is a really rare exception. And most neuroscience institutes, most ALS centers don't have that luxury. And it shouldn't be a luxury. It's part of healthcare. So let me take that word back.
I also just really wanted to quickly touch on what you said, Gwen. You were talking about, the communication aspect too, of when verbally that's not necessarily possible. And I will tell you that part of this is sitting in the discomfort of that, right? So that could be, if utilization of assistive devices is possible, right? Maybe there is a delay in the way that you communicate, and owning that and sitting in that discomfort still allows you to move forward and communicate. Sometimes I've worked with patients that sometimes we are just using very, behavioral cues, nonverbal ways of communicating. Obviously we want to get it beyond yes and no, but finding ways to, meet the gap, right? But I think honestly, as Dr. Thomas is saying, connecting with other folks who have had these circumstances, right? And pooling resources together, like what do you use to have these conversations, right? I think that's incredibly important too. So I just want to make sure that was touched on.
Perfect. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Florian. Donnie, that's all the questions we have.
Thank you so much, Gwen and Desi. We do have one more question from the Q&A. What tools are available for caregivers?
Well, I mean, similarly, it is seeking, psychosocial support. I do know that different, associations will have support groups for caregivers. One of the best things that you can do is in different medical appointments, like asking the certain hospital affiliations, what is available. I will say at NSI, where we work, we do have caregiver support, right? But sometimes it's really about directly asking the question. It might not always immediately come to you. I would love that. That would be an amazing part, that it was just invited to you the moment that you step foot in a medical practice. But sometimes you just have to ask the more direct questions, and getting over that hurdle can get you access to more resources.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sessa. And just to piggyback off of what Dr. Thomas said earlier about ALS United Greater New York mental health program, we do have a new mental health program where we have in-house clinicians available that are providing mental health psychotherapy sessions free of charge. So if anyone in the audience is interested in getting these mental health services, please feel free to reach out to the care services team in your region, and we'll be more than happy to assist you with getting a part of this program. I want to thank our panelists and our presenters again. for your honesty, your vulnerability, and insight during today's session. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here and creating space for these important conversations. Caregiving in ALS is an act of love, is an act of resilience, partnership, adaptation. And today's session just reminded us that no one should have to navigate that journey alone. We hope you will continue to join us for our next session at 12:30, where we will be discussing intimacy in ALS, which is a very important conversation centered on connection, relationships, and maintaining closeness throughout this ALS journey. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Take care.